Sounds good. Thank you, Matthew. Our first presentation is from Dr. Lisa Bostaph from Boise State University. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm going to be totally transparent and tell you that I have written out this entire talk because as my students and other people who have seen me present before know, I love to talk and I love to talk about this stuff. So I want to make sure that I'm trying to keep us on track. So if you see me looking over, totally transparent, I have notes, lots of notes. So good morning, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. And I want to thank Matthew Gamet, the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, and NIJ for the opportunity to talk about the work we've been doing in Idaho and the Research to Policy Bridge. Just a brief introduction, I am Dr. Lisa Bostaph. I'm a professor of criminal justice at Boise State University, where I've been teaching, doing research, and working with community agencies and organizations for almost 20 years. I received my PhD in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati, go Bearcats, in 2003, where I specialized in policing and the functioning of the criminal justice system and society. Prior to getting my PhD education, though, I worked in battered treatment at the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota, the home of the power and control wheel and the birthplace of coordinated community response. I also built Project Peace, which is a crime scene crisis intervention project for 4 policing departments in the Minneapolis, Minnesota metropolitan area. That's a big mouthful. And was a victim witness coordinator for a district attorney's office. I titled this presentation Transformative Collaborations because I do believe that partnerships between agencies, organizations, and academics can result in positive changes to policy and practice. Community-based research is research that's conducted for the purpose of identifying or addressing a need in the community, formulating or evaluating a policy or program affecting a community, or solving a problem within a community. It's the practical sister of theoretical research, but that's not necessarily a dichotomous choice between either theoretical or community or practical research. Community-based research can be used to test theoretical constructs. But more concretely, community-based research involves a partnership between a community program or agency and an academic researcher, whether that's a faculty member or a student or both. For researchers and agencies, the real benevolent reason to engage in these partnerships is to contribute to the creation of a better society, or to affect policy or affect social change in an area of interest, and or the advancement of scientific knowledge by offering a real world laboratory. For researchers, the practical reasons to engage in this research, this type of research, are many. We're required to do research. That's part of our job. Community-based research provides us with white papers and presentations, as well as data for later peer-reviewed publications. And we're also required to do service. And there are certainly some unfunded community-based research projects that I have labeled service in my workload, because I believe that there are plenty of opportunities for me to use my research skills to actually engage in service to our community. Students working on these projects get exposure to different agencies, which can assist them in deciding what they want to do after graduation. And for graduate students specifically, it's an opportunity for them to obtain data for their theses. Finally, in the summertime, it's an opportunity for additional income if the research is funded. That can supplement faculty salaries during the summer when they're off contract. And while it's not a primary driver, particularly for me, I know that for some faculty members, especially those who are just starting out, that is a draw. For programs and agencies, those practical reasons are also many in number. It can mean assistance in addressing a need or problem that the agency either doesn't have the expertise in or doesn't currently have the capacity to do. It can also address funding issues, including getting the work done for free or a reduced amount, receiving a white paper or a presentation that can be used as a basis for a funding request, and if the research is funded, it provides additional monies for existing or pilot programs. Finally, agencies also get exposure to students. I've had a number of students who have been hired by agencies where they have been involved in community-based research. primarily because these students have been on site day after day or multiple times, and they've had a chance to interact with those students. They see what they're capable of producing. And so when they've had an opening, students have applied and they've been able to be hired by those agencies. While it's not necessary and everyone has to have a first, it is easier to establish these collaborations when there's an environment conducive to partnerships. I've included a few examples here that we participated in that predate our current project, along with the partners on each collaboration. And you can see that there were vast array of partners, often the same partners across these tables, but I think it provides us a little selection of what we've done over the past 20 years in terms of partnerships. But my primary focus for this presentation is the work we've been doing on our biennial reports on victimization and victim services in Idaho. This is a partnership between our research team and the Idaho Council on Domestic Violence and Victim Assistance, which is one of our VOCA funders for the state. The purpose of the biennial report series is to build the knowledge base about victimization and victim services in Idaho through research and by making recommendations for policy and practice based on the results of these studies. We committed to conducting 2 series of 4 studies each, listed here, and all of the reports from our first series of studies were released a year ago, almost to the day. You can access them on our new and ever-evolving website, www.idvch.com, which is Idaho Victimization Clearinghouse. These reports are written for practitioners and policymakers, and because of that, we're keeping them to a shorter length, about 20 pages. Now, 20 pages may not seem short to some, but we've produced reports in the past that are between 45 and 150 pages, and they are not helpful for policymakers at that length. We also keep our use of scientific jargon to a minimum, incorporate lots of visual displays of information, and include recommendations for policy and practice that are supported by our findings. In order to make our findings even easier to digest, we produce infographics for each report at the time of release. These seem to have worked particularly well in interacting with the media. This infographic is one that was produced for our first report on the effects of an Idaho Supreme Court decision eliminating warrantless arrest for misdemeanor domestic violence, which literally overnight upended 30 years of practice in criminal justice and left Idaho as the only state in the country without the use of warrantless arrest in misdemeanor domestic violence, an evidence-based practice supported by decades of research. Within hours of the public release of this report, the Supreme Court in Idaho began the process of implementing at least 2 of the recommendations, and other recommendations impacted policy and practice over the next several months. For the remainder of my time, though, I'll be discussing our evaluation of the effect of Idaho's sexual assault kit testing statutes on clearance rates for sexual assault crimes. Our research question was born out of conversations and comments we had or saw in the media about sexual assault kit testing, many of which seemed to indicate a belief among community members that the mere testing of a sexual assault kit would lead to increases in arrests and convictions. Yet there was no scientific research to our knowledge that demonstrated such an effect, particularly for the bulk of sexual assault cases which do not involve unknown assailants. So we decided this was a question in need of research and that it could prove to also be educational for community members. We were fortunate in some respects that the Idaho legislature passed a series of statutes before ultimately passing a test all version in 2019, because this afforded us a natural experiment where we could establish pre and post time periods to examine sexual assault case processing. Since we really didn't have any prior research to use as an example, we decided to use our first report to try out our methodology. So we set the 1 year before the first statute, HB 528, went into effect as our pretest, and the 1 year following it as its post-test. One of the most difficult aspects of conducting this kind of research in criminal justice is that there is no centralized statewide searchable database of all crimes reported to police that includes all case and investigative information. What I mean is that there's no database online or otherwise where I can search for all sexual assault cases, which, as you know, cross a number of different statutes, and then be able to access which ones had SACs and which ones didn't in order to draw a sample. And then finally, be able to access the case file information to examine investigative activities, decision-making, victim cooperation, and clearance codes. So what we needed was a data set that would have all of the cases in the state with a sexual assault kit. That was the crime lab. So we reached out to Matthew. We had a meeting in person to explain what we wanted to do, and asked him for access to the data. Of course, as Matthew mentioned, as a researcher, we have to be cognizant of the limitations that agencies may have or the reticence they may have with respect to sharing their data. Matthew told us he'd be okay with providing us a spreadsheet of every sexual assault kit that came to the lab, the date it arrived, the date the analysis was complete, the agency that submitted it, the date of the crime, and the crime type associated with the kit at submission. No victim information, no suspect information, and no tracking number. That was fine. That's totally fine because we can take it from there. And how we did that was by contacting policing agencies for the rest of the data. We also used the court's repository to gather data on charging and convictions, but we haven't analyzed that data yet. So what we did was we drew a random sample of sexual assault kits from the data that we got from Matthew that were submitted during our pretest time. That gave us our experimental group. We then contacted each policing agency associated with those kits and requested copies of the case files. No identifiable victim information was released. We also requested that each agency provide us with a sexual assault case reported during the same time period that did not have a sexual assault kit. And that gave us our control group. You can see here the sample sizes for this pilot project. We ended up with a total of 68 reports across 23 different agencies in the state. Once we had our case file information, we conducted a content analysis where we coded, and as Matthew pointed out, for us as researchers, coding means we're looking for data points, for 115 different variables concerning the suspect, case characteristics, and the response by police. At the end, we had roughly 7,000 data points. I mean, way more than we could include in a 20-page report. Here are the characteristics of those cases with a sexual assault kit across the population of all cases provided to us by the crime lab, those included in the sample, and then the sample broken down into pre and post-test samples. All right, so I'm going to run through the different characteristics that we examined in our study, but it's time for our first poll question. What proportion of cases in our sample do you think involved strangers? Your choices are 0%, 20%, 40%, or 60%. All right, so let's go and start voting. Okay, so what I see here is that roughly 82% of you chose 20% as the proportion of cases that involved strangers. There we go. As you can see here, only 5% of the cases involved strangers. So the closest answer was actually 0%. The most frequent victim offender relationship was friend or acquaintance at 61%. This is in line with most reported sexual assault cases, and that the vast majority, sometimes upwards of 80%, occur between people who are known to each other. Some other characteristics of the sample: Victims were overwhelmingly female and suspects overwhelmingly male. Reported assaults occurred primarily between males and females. A little over half of victims were adults, while the vast majority of suspects were adults. Most child victims were 12 years of age or younger. There was very little reported drug use among victims or suspects at the time of the assault, and about a quarter each, victims and suspects, reported having consumed alcohol. There were no significant differences among any of these characteristics between cases pre and post HB 528 or between those with and without sexual assault kits. All right, so crime characteristics. Not surprisingly, the crimes identified at initial reporting and those identified at the end of the investigation changed somewhat. However, there were no significant pre and post differences or experimental and control group differences. A majority of victims in the sample had injuries above and beyond the actual sexual aspect of the assault, and a little over 1/3 had multiple injuries. We saw our first significant differences here among the pre and post test groups, with cases occurring after HB 528 was passed involving more injuries, as did cases that had sexual assault kits. Some other case characteristics in the sample that were not significantly different were engaging in quote unquote risky behaviors, which we defined as behaviors that would decrease the likelihood of someone intervening or preventing or stopping an assault. Many of these are just everyday activities, like being out alone after dark. Some of them are things like choosing to be alone with someone you had just recently met. Of course, none of these activities are justifications for assaulting another person. And honestly, many of them are only considered risky because it's women engaging in them. We also gathered data on the type of resistance the victim was able to engage in. I use that terminology, able to engage in, as much of Dr. Rebecca Campbell's work that you will hear about has focused on increasing our understanding of how trauma affects the body, and that resistance is often outside the conscious control of victims during an assault. Other characteristics are the presence of witnesses who could provide any information, those who could corroborate any aspect of the victim's statement, or who were direct witnesses of the assault. And also, we looked at whether the assault was drug facilitated. There are other characteristics of cases that involve the actual investigation phase of processing, which is why we needed access to those case files. Here you can see other evidence that was collected as part of the investigation, with audio recorded interviews being most frequent. Not surprisingly, cases with a sexual assault kit were more likely to have photographic evidence than those without a sexual assault kit. There were no other significant differences. Years of research have demonstrated that in sexual assault cases, officers' perspectives on victims' credibility is an important variable to account for. We measured victim credibility in multiple ways and coded for instances where officers made specific notes in the files about any of these issues. I would be remiss here if I did not point out that multiple research studies and FBI data indicate that victims rarely make false accusations about sexual assault, ranging anywhere from 2 to 10%. In our data, the most frequently mentioned issue about victim credibility was a victim's reluctance to discuss the assault, which I think many of us can understand. There were no significant differences between cases pre and post HB 528, that statute, or those with and without a sexual assault kit. Next poll. What proportion of victims in these cases cooperated with the investigation? Your choices are 0%, 30%, 60%, or 90%. All right, go ahead and choose. And remember, we're not going to see those results until 60% of you respond to that poll. I'm going to take that moment to have a little drink of water.
The poll is launched. We're at about 55% right now, Lisa.
Okay.
30% and 60% are in the lead at about 45% each. And we just hit 62% participation rate. So we should be good to share.
And there we go. Look at that. An even split between 30 and 60%. Depending on which measure of cooperation you want to go with here, those who chose 90% and those who chose 60% were the closest options given to you. Almost all victims cooperated at the scene or at the time of reporting, and almost 3/4 cooperated throughout the entire investigation. There were no significant differences between groups of cases. Other significant differences involved when the crime was reported. Cases without a sexual assault kit were more likely to include a delay of 24 hours or more. That's understandable. And those involved less than half of all of our cases. 1/3 of victims told investigators that they were still fearful of the suspect during the investigation phase. So what did officers do in these cases? In terms of connecting victims to services, officers called a victim service provider to the scene, or offered to contact one at the scene, or provided the victim with a referral to a victim service provider anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of cases. We noted there were 56 unique policing professionals who were the primary officer in these cases. Half of them were investigators who were the sole responders. In most cases, the initial decision at the time or at the scene or at the time of reporting, as you would expect, was that further investigation was needed. There were no significant differences in the pre-test, post-test groups or the experimental and control groups. So how were these cases cleared? They were cleared in a variety of ways, with cleared by arrest or warrant for arrest being the most frequent clearance code. And yet it was only in a little more than 1/3 of cases. There were actually 15 different clearance codes in the sample. 23% of cases were cleared the same day they were reported. That's not always a positive sign, with the average time to clearance being about 1.5 months. One significant difference not involving pre or post test or experimental or control groups was that significantly fewer arrests occurred in cases where officers noted a credibility issue. There were, in fact, no differences between cases before and after passage of HB 528 or between cases with and without sexual assault kits. The noting of victim credibility issues was the only significant predictor of a case being cleared by arrest or being deemed inactive. The other outcome we were interested in was how long it took to clear sexual assault crimes. Here we found some differences. Cases in the pretest group, those before HB 528 was passed, took longer to clear than those in the post-test group after the statute was passed. Conversely, cases where officers noted victim credibility issues were dispatched with more quickly than those without those issues noted. Again, this may very well not be a positive outcome. Finally, sexual assault kits had no significant effect on case clearance, either the clearance decision or the length of time to clearance. As part of this study, we also wanted to survey those officers who were primarily responsible for the investigation to ask them about their perceptions of the case, the investigation, the clearance decision, their attitudes about the test all statutes. And we had an optional survey about burnout and stress that I won't discuss here today. So we reached out to chiefs and sheriffs and asked for these 56 officers' email addresses. You can see here that not all of them were investigators, and some of them appeared in more than one sexual assault case in our sample. We were surprised we had such a good response rate for this online survey, honestly. Among police officer survey research, a 67% completion rate is considered very good. Among this sample of officers, just over half had between 10 and 19 years of experience, and almost the entire sample had at least some college education. Only a third had prior military service, and most of these officers were white, male, non-Hispanic, and married, and that's pretty reflective of policing in general. While the survey was comprehensive, and we owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Brad Campbell at the University of Louisville and Dr. Ken Novak at the University of Missouri at Kansas City, who both shared some questions that they've used on investigative surveys with officers. I'm only going to cover a few aspects of the survey. First, we asked officers how important physical evidence is to their investigation and subsequent clearing of cases. Officers were divided on that importance, with 47% stating that it depends on other aspects of the case, and 43% saying that physical evidence is important. We then asked them what type of physical evidence they found to be important in sexual assault cases. They listed 17 different types of physical evidence, with the most frequently mentioned being potential forensic evidence and crime scene documentation. 32% of officers specifically mentioned sexual assault kits. We also asked officers how they determined victim credibility, and they offered 21 different factors. I've included the most frequently mentioned categories in this chart, and you can see that victim statement or statements tops the list. Interestingly, and for many, I think as a sign of progress, is that 16% of respondents indicated that they consider themselves to be fact finders, and that the role of determining credibility was for later stages of the criminal justice process. Since the perfect case is somewhat of a unicorn, we asked them how they thought a case would go if strong evidence existed, but the victim did not want to cooperate. A little more than half thought the case should go forward anyway, with 41% indicating the case should go inactive until the victim changed their mind. For 3/4 of respondents, even a victim recanting shouldn't necessarily be a death knell to the investigation. But more likely, there won't be corroboration of the victim's statements. In that scenario, officers were split, with 45% saying it should go inactive until other evidence is uncovered, and 41% stating that it should still move forward. When we asked officers what case characteristics are most likely to lead to arrest, victim and suspect characteristics, as well as physical evidence, were most frequently mentioned. When we asked the same question about having the prosecutor review for charging, we noticed that most officers discussed this in two ways. What factors would lead to screening in of cases, that is, determining which case should be reviewed, and what would lead to screening out cases or deciding that a case should not be reviewed by a prosecutor. For screening in, it was clear that evidence was the primary factor in sending a case to the prosecutor, with the totality of the circumstances and victim characteristics playing a lesser role. There was only one factor mentioned by respondents in screening out cases: victim credibility. Okay, here's our final poll. What percent of policing professionals supported test all legislation? Your choices are 10%, 25%, 50%, and 75%. All right, we're pros at this now, so let's hit that 60% response.
The results are coming in, and 75% has taken an early lead. I feel like I'm announcing like a horse race. We are at 60%, and about half of the audience said 75%, 1/3 at about 50%.
Okay. Well, remember your choices because I'm going to hold you in suspense. Don't look ahead on the screen. First, we asked officers to identify the importance of having a sexual assault kit in making various investigative decisions. You can see here that most officers indicated that its importance was relative to other physical evidence, in relation to other physical evidence, depended on the individual aspects of each case. But a majority found that sexual assault kits were important in identifying suspects, making arrests, and in conducting investigations, even though thus far in our studies, we have found no effect of a sexual assault kit on the decision to arrest. Now, your answer to the poll question, 72% of officers supported test all for SAC. So the bulk of you who chose 75%, right on the nose. I've included a few comments from officers to demonstrate reasons why they did or did not support test all. The two quotes in support illustrate two themes we heard from supporters: reduce mistakes and this notion of it being the right thing to do. Those who were less supportive fell into two camps: those who thought the facts of the case should determine the need for testing, and when resources are limited, they should be used judiciously. Based on our findings from the case review portion of our study, we made a number of recommendations concerning policy, practice, and future legislation, some of which have been implemented or proposed. Our first recommendation regarding the expansion of victim services had to do with the lack of sexual assault services for victims in many of our rural and remote locations, which led to officers not being able to connect victims at the scene to that assistance. Part of that gap is because Idaho doesn't have a state appropriation for victim services, unlike most other states, and relies solely on federal funding distributed to states from VOCA. We've made this recommendation in nearly every report on victimization we've issued in the past decade. We were just informed last week that Governor Little included a line item in his proposed budget for that state appropriation. I was also notified only yesterday that a bill has been submitted to the legislature this session to address our recommendation number 2, extending the statutory requirement of providing information on available victim services to sexual assault victims, as well as domestic violence victims. Our recommendation on the need for widespread training on the neurobiological effects of trauma on victims, rape myths, societal stigma faced by sexual violence victims, and effective responses was undertaken this past fall by the Crime Lab with funding assistance from Ryman. They began offering a series of trainings around the state this past September. Now, this is not the first presentation we've been asked to do on this study, and we also did a fair amount of media around it as well. In discussing our recommendation for continuing to prioritize SAC testing, we recognize that this would require additional funding for the Crime Lab and always include that point in our discussions. We know we've right now begun conducting our follow-up study, which will replicate our first study in examining pre and post-test 1-year periods before and after each of the 3 subsequent pieces of sexual assault kit legislation in Idaho. The neat thing about this methodology is that the post-test year for one statutory change is the pre-test year for the next one, which reduces our data collection in half. And then we'll be able to also conduct an overall evaluation of the effects of the entire sexual assault kit initiative legislation on sexual assault case processing. We're hoping to release that report this fall. And again, we're collaborating with the Crime Lab for our starting point in creating the samples for this study. I hope really that in this presentation, you've been able to see that these collaborations can truly be transformative in terms of policy and practice, which in turn have real life impacts on our communities. I'm here presenting, but I'm not doing all of this work on my own. So here's the whole team and my contact information. please don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions, or if you want to brainstorm, I'm always happy to talk about this. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Excellent.
And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Lisa. With that, we're going to enter our Q&A session where we have a short session. It'll be about 5 minutes. With that, I'm going to send it over to Matthew to moderate.
Got a few questions coming in. I'm not sure if you're able to see the question and answers, but Ebony asking, you mentioned credibility issues. Are you talking about credibility issues with the victim, suspect, or both?
With the victim.
Okay. Question coming in from Alejandro. How would you define clearance rate? Suspect was identified and arrested during follow-up investigation and was indicted. Suspect was identified but was not arrested, and the police directly filed the case in court? Question.
So we use the clearance codes that are used by policing agencies that they then report with their NIBRS data to actually ISP to the PGR and the Statistical Analysis Center who look at that data. So we just used the clearance codes that were used by policing agencies, and they were kind enough to provide us with a cheat sheet.
Fantastic. Again, a question from Ebony coming in regarding this particular survey and results. Were the survey participants split 50-50 between male and female law enforcement, or was it random?
The survey was based on what policing professionals, because some were officers, some were deputies, were involved in the actual cases in our sample. So we did not survey anybody except for the officers who were the primary responders in those cases in our sample.
Fantastic. Let me just scroll down. There's a few more questions coming in. Ebony's asking, can you give examples of credibility issues with the victims?
Sure. So we measured, I think it was probably 8 to 10 different victim credibility issues that have been noted in prior research. So things like inconsistency in statements, prior criminal history, a prior sexual relationship with the suspect, victims who have memory issues in recounting the assault. Those are just some of the examples of the credibility issues that we look to see if officers noted in the files.
Fantastic. Lisa, from your perspective, I mean, that's amazing data. I loved your presentation. Tell us what your experience has been in collaborating with us. Are there areas where we need to improve? Where do you think we go next?
No, I have no complaints. No, it's been great. And I'm always a little skittish because I know that you guys are overtaxed. And so I always try to make my requests like, you don't have to get this to me for 30 days. I won't need it till then, so don't rush. So I don't have any concerns about it at all. I look forward to seeing what we can do with the data moving forward. I'm really excited about the follow-up study because understand that some of those cases that we had in the pretest, right, they're from 2015. Their kits were submitted in 2015, which meant some of the crime dates were really old. And so I'm really looking forward to having getting these more recent data points, these more recent case files, because it would be really interesting to see how potentially investigations have changed, and also if the use of sexual assault kits has changed, and how they affect investigations.
Dr. Bostaph, just amazing presentation. I was enthralled by it. I know the audience they're posting in amazing things in the chat, lots of questions. So I know you shared out your contact information and made the offer they can contact you. Very generous. We appreciate that. So we will share out what you're comfortable with sharing out on the slides. For those of you viewing, this information is being archived. So FTCOE will have this on their website so you can review some of the statistics that were presented today. Again, we're grateful and fantastic presentation. Dr. Bostaph again has been willing to participate with us in the round robin discussion at the end of today. So please stay tuned for that so that we can ask her some additional questions and how her research might interact with some of these other researchers that we're talking to today. Also wanted to just mention there's a few questions in the chat about the slides in the presentation that I gave initially. Yes, that presentation will also be available to you. I wanted to mention as well some of the information about the dating apps that people are asking about. That will be presented in a few minutes by Dr. Julie Valentine from Brigham Young University. So we'll let that question go until we're able to talk to her. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tyler. I think we're going to bring on Dr. Speaker next.